Grazie. Grazie tanti. I'm going to talk about framing, about the act of framing. When you go to a museum, the paintings on the walls are almost all rectangular or square. And they're usually in elaborate frames, even gold-plated and extravagant, to signal to the viewer that what these frames contain is precious. So, what's inside the frame is valuable, is worth looking at, can be art. What's outside is the wall. Nothing. The absence of any value or meaning. So what's included in the frame is a strong statement of preservation, of appreciation, of love, of consideration, enjoyment, admiration, and what's outside is forever forgotten, neglected, even despised, but definitely left out. It's a choice. The whole thing has a long tradition for centuries and centuries, which had consequences for our minds. The quadrangular format has become synonymous with a painting, or more generally with a picture. And framing is no longer just the job of the man who builds the gold frame, but soon applied to the process of selecting what is supposed to be inside the frame and what is to remain outside forever. After centuries and centuries of art in square or rectangular paintings, the new art of photography also produced such formats. And when the photographers looked through their square viewfinder, what they did was now called framing. Their decision was going to be, their decision was what was going to be in the picture and what was not. And that decision now concerned reality, not just imagination. Cinema doubled up on the act of framing and multiplied it, as it was into storytelling, not just description. So each scene soon consisted of a sequence of film frames that became a language: movies, moving frames, moving pictures, motion pictures. You are all doing this now, even on your smartphones, if you want it or not. Well, not all the time and not all of you. Some people are just aiming at something and not framing anything specific, and no images are framed as badly as selfies, but that's a different subject. Anyway, I want to talk to you about the act of framing. Why? Well, because it's so basic that most of you take it for granted and probably never thought about it. But those are the greatest discoveries, the things we never think about. So I'd like to turn you on to that particular subject. Because framing is an act very dear to me. It means a lot to me. I'd even say it has become essential for me, almost existential sometimes. So I figured it could be useful to think about it for once publicly in front of others with you here at the Fondazione MAST, Manifattura di Arti, Sperimentazione e Tecnologia. The act of framing is right there, in the middle between art and technology. And as we are in Bologna, the city of l'immagine ritrovata, frames are even doubly essential here. For every restored film, 24 frames per second, 24 frames per second have to be first scanned in 4K, and that's a horizontal screen resolution of 4,000 pixels, 4,000 horizontally, and then restored each and every one of these frames. No other city works so much on so many million frames. Each of them, in the beginning, was the result of a conscious act of framing. So I have the feeling it could be worth exploring this act a bit more. Because framing has a lot to do with many aspects of our lives. With our act of remembering, or at least wanting to remember. With our capacity to make choices. With our sense of aesthetics. With our preferences, period. With our attitude towards others, and with our way of dealing with the world. But framing definitely has to do with our act of seeing the world. Let's start here with seeing. Our eyes as such see quite a large field. It's open. It is rather unstructured, shapeless somehow, a bit roundish maybe, perhaps oval, with vague or fraying edges, rather vignetting like old photographs. Anyway, our field of vision feels relatively unlimited. And because we can let our eyes wander, turn our head, or even turn our body around, our field of vision doesn't seem to have any framework, unless, of course, you wear glasses. Framing introduces a different notion to our eyes, a clearly selective one. It's an act that concentrates the amorphous image of everything we see to a specific one. Yes, square or rectangular it is. And it tries to work out with that condensation and turn it into a picture. Turn the world into an image of the world. In a nutshell, that is my job. But not only mine, any photographer or filmmaker does their job. Setting the frame or deciding on the framing, deciding what's in and what's out, what's to be remembered and what's to be forgotten, what to be lifted up into the light and what to remain in darkness. As this is not just an activity essential to my professional practice, but also a very personal, sometimes even intimate occupation, I want to talk to you about that act of framing, strictly from my own personal point of view, not in general or abstractly. I know how different people's visual experiences are. Everyone perceives colors, forms, and shapes differently. And also the perception of space and depth are by no means standardized. Each and every one of you creates his or her own colors, his or her own space. And therefore, I strongly assume that the perception and notion of framing and how the act of framing happens might also be individually different. I'll begin my account with painting, because for me the whole framing thing actually started with that, with noticing paintings in frames. And then later, because I liked what I saw, wanting to doodle, to draw, to do watercolors and paint myself. My childlike insight into and first ever encounter with art started with the afternoon hours spent every day staring at the pictures on the wall of our bedroom, where completely unnecessarily I felt I was supposed to take a nap every afternoon. I was 3 or 4 years old, and here's what I saw. The all too familiar sunflowers by Van Gogh, in a faded, not that beautiful, in a faded cheap print and mounted in a dull frame. Luckily accompanied by 2 small prints of landscapes by Camille Corot. Nicer. Female figures under large trees, framed by prefabricated gold frames made from plaster, chipped at the corners, but at least these little frames offered a view into the distance. And there were these women and the interesting shapes of trees and clouds. I spent hours looking at every detail until I knew every stem, every leaf, and every sunflower seed in Van Gogh's vase too, even if I liked that painting less and less. I missed the expanse behind it. Just the table and a wall behind wasn't enough for me. Why did I need a wall in front of my wall? This picture always seemed like a prison to me. It was more an obstruction to the view than a window out to the open. In contrast to my beloved miniature landscapes by Corot, as crummy as they were. But they allowed a view into the depth and gave an idea of the horizon. My fondness of pictures that actually showed the horizon must have started here somehow. Anyway, it was already very clear for me at the time, outside of a frame there was nothing, just a terrible void, appropriately symbolized by our ugly wallpaper. But inside the frame was a glimpse into another world. Only a cutout, sure, but better than nothing. This childish awareness totally determined my later artistic practice. The frame decides what's inside it. A section of the world that is cut out of it, so to speak, and what was inside the frame, I learned that from those paintings on the wall, represented, in my eyes, a much more beautiful world than the bombed-out post-war city of Düsseldorf around us. So, I became the child who dragged his parents to the museums, not the other way around. In there, I felt resided a better world, art. and that world was always framed. For the budding young painter who I aspired to become since my childhood, there always existed predetermined frames that were simply defined by the sheet of paper or later the prefabricated canvas. Their formats simply preceded, here it is, their formats simply preceded any desire to paint, and they were all rectangular. In landscape format, or if you turned it around, horizontal. Whatever I wanted to put on there, whatever I wanted to capture or express on them already had a given frame. Its shape, format, and proportions were predetermined and already fixed before the artistic effort could even begin. The material already offered the cadrage, voilà the fancy word, a French word for framing. When I applied the pencil, the brush, or whatever, it already knew its space of freedom as well as its limits. Anything that would want to go beyond the edges would never exist, except in another picture or in another frame. The format, that predetermined space, limited my possibilities and excluded any outbreaks or escapes. The world, whether an imaginary one in my mind or the real one in front of me that I wanted to draw, had to fit in any case into the cadrage. The paper prescribed what pencil and I were allowed to do. And then came photography and my first camera. It opened up to me the opposite of the framing I knew from art. When I looked through the viewfinder, there was a frame, yes, but I could move it. And what had been forever excluded in the pictures on the wall, here it was accessible, at least latently present. I just had to pan the camera across, and the whole world moved into my frame. My apparatus was just a plastic box, a cheap 6x6 roll film camera, and unfortunately, I had to look down to it. It hung in front of my chest, and so I had to look away from what I saw in front of me and wanted to photograph. I had to look away and to look down instead, towards the floor, into this dark little square. That ruined all the fun for me. My pictures were all out of balance, crookedly framed, in fact. I disliked it immensely to have to look away from what I wanted to see. So neither the square 6x6 image was my thing, nor to get the horizon line adjusted, which needed a reverse movement. It was a dance. Luckily, my father understood my malaise. So that camera was soon exchanged. That unloved camera was exchanged for another one that I could now hold in front of my eyes. Immediately, my framing was always straight. I could keep my second eye open and thus continue to see everything else that otherwise was excluded in the viewfinder. And the image was no longer square, but rectangular, and that was my thing too. Not only my eye, both my eyes felt good, but also my body. My hands were suddenly relaxed, as were my arms. My whole little figure was no longer standing crookedly in the landscape to make a straight picture, but my whole self was involved. Seeing and capturing what I saw became a sheer pleasure. Like here in my home city, the day before the fairground opened. Soon my hands and arms were able to take photographs as if all by themselves. Where I wanted to put the horizon line was only a tiny correction by the fingers. And where that horizon belonged had been shown to me quite convincingly by all the Dutch landscape painters. My legs were also involved. How large something should appear in the picture was a question answered by a few steps forward or backwards, like towards and around these boats at low tide in Brittany. So my feet and my hands determined, together with the eyes, the details of the framing. How wide, how close, how centered, how low or high in the frame. And the frame was no longer prefabricated and limited, like by the sheet of paper. On the contrary, framing was suddenly a fabulous act of the entire body. I only had to move back or forth, to the left or the right, and the framing took place all by itself. At the same time, the frame was defined in the true sense of the word by my relationship to what I saw, my feelings, my attitude towards the people, the objects, the place in the frame. It was that correlation that became the image. That was a key experience for me about framing. The disposition of your mind towards your subject, your innermost, even subconscious or unconscious sentiments find their concretization, their manifestation in your picture and in its frame. Something of yourself actually ends up in any frame you decide on. You leave traces inside any image you take, an invisible reverse angle. As the focal length of the camera's lens that I owned corresponded approximately to the angle, the focal length of my eyes, framing was just a decision which section of my field of vision I wanted to see in the viewfinder and reproduce as a photograph. And that was no longer just an aesthetic decision, but a bodily task as well. Everything I needed to know or understand about framing had already been demonstrated to me by painters. I assume Cézanne also walked backwards or forwards with his easel until the Montagne Sainte-Victoire fitted into his frame and on his canvas. That's why I never liked focal length other than those that somehow correspond to the human eye. A range from a slight wide angle, a 28 or 32 millimeter in the world of 35 millimeter film, up to Yasujiro Ozu's favorite lens, the 50 millimeter, a slight telelens, which, however, I would only use for close-ups. Anyway, the first time I ever encountered a zoom lens, I was horrified. and rejected this optical aberration. It was nothing more than the circumvention of body language to avoid the physical effort of moving backwards and forwards in framing an image. It was just for lazy people. It was for uninvolved eyes and legs. No painter would have ever worked with a zoom. And as much as I liked photography, I still wanted to become a painter. So I went to Paris. Where else? And as the Academy of Beaux-Arts didn't want me, didn't accept me, I ended up studying in the atelier of a great contemporary etcher and learned the beautiful craft of copper engraving. We were 12 students, and our master paid great attention to each and every one of us. When he saw my first efforts, he encouraged me to go on with it. I had a plate of copper in front of me, square, of course, like a page, and I had followed a strange intuition. It was an important moment in my life, that intuition. You know, a great influence in my youth had been my love for comic strips. I had invested all my pocket money in comics. Superman, Spider-Man, Prince Valiant, but most of all, Disney comics. No, not Mickey Mouse, the old fascist, but Donald Duck, the eternal optimist and loser. With his entire gang of nephews, a girlfriend, maybe lover, and a rich uncle, millionaire. I learned everything about capitalism right there. So I started engraving a comic strip. Now, with none of my favorite characters, it was rather an abstract comic strip. Comic strips were great storytelling devices. They had it all. It, in this case, was a narration in many small boxes or frames. Neatly lined up, there were wide shots, close-ups, insert shots, reverse angles, over shoulders. In short, the whole grammar of cinema, except that I couldn't have named that grammar back then. That came a bit later. But still, how you read and tell a story in a succession of angles and frames, I had already learned as a kid before I knew what it could be good for one day. To make a long story short, our engraving class lasted until early afternoon. Afterwards, I was alone and only had a very small cold room under the roof and very little money, so movie theaters were too expensive. And I discovered the French Cinematheque instead, where you could see a film for what would have been at the time 250 lira in Italy. And for 1,000 lira, imagine, basically a cup of coffee, I could see 4 films. I saw more than 1,000 films in my time in Paris, and then I knew movies were even better than painting. They included everything else I liked. I gave up on wanting to become a painter, decided on a life as filmmaker, and went to film school in Munich, Germany. At that school, they hadn't really figured out how to teach film yet. It was too early for them. They actually had not foreseen a single film camera for their students. So I sold my tenor saxophone in order to buy a used Bolex 60mm camera. and all my friends and myself shot lots of movies on it. And I'll show you a little piece of my first 60mm film, Silver City Revisited. You might have noticed, no, that is not foreseen in my text. But you might have noticed that was still closer to painting and photography than to filmmaking. I didn't know anything about storytelling, yet they had not told us in film school. I was simply thrilled that a 60mm Bolex could capture movement, not just fixed images like a still camera, but movement and time. In Silver City Revisited, there was only the fixed gaze of the painter within his canvas. Outside of that, everything was still gone, non-existent. It will forever remain a mystery where that man ran to who jumped over the tracks in front of the train. Maybe he's there. This film was rudimentary, consisting of 12 fixed shots that were not connected to each other, but rather provided frames in which the world could be captured in motion. And that in itself was already so much that I was completely satisfied for the time being, to take one shot after another and produce one frame after another. I wasn't into storytelling yet, but that came soon. When I realized that pasting one moving frame after the other, the result represented something that was more than the sum of its parts. Even in such rudimentary montage as you've seen, something emerged that the painter or photographer could not have expressed in a single picture. And that was the beginning, the first glimpse of a narrative that could become storytelling. I'll spare you all the intermediate steps and go straight forward to my first real film after film school with a real camera that could not only capture movement, but that also could be moved on tracks, on a dolly, in cars, and where I was able to experience for the first time what it's like when a film crew, along with their camera, goes on a journey. In my script for the goalie's anxiety at the penalty kick, first film of mine, there was a rather short and terse sentence. It said, Bloch, that was the goalkeeper, Bloch takes a bus and travels to the country near the border. Because the whole team had to go there anyway, from Vienna to the country, we all took a bus together with our equipment, and I just had to fill that line. He takes a bus and travels to the country. And it was on this journey that I was able to experience for the first time and for only one day what's it like to shoot on the road. A little notice for the projectionists. I make a jump now. This lasted longer than I thought. I go to page 13 on the top. One of the smallest, yet most efficient editing units in filmmaking is the result of these two frames following each other. One would be a close-up of a person looking at something, and the other is the cut to what he or she is seeing. It's a tiny and very basic combination of two shots that can do wonders. It conveys somebody's point of view, her or his point of view, but it not only reveals what the person is seeing, but it also deciphers how she or he is looking, what the interest is, what it means to that person to see what the next cut then also shows to the audience. For me, this little combination is often a miraculous revelation how much that small exchange can do for the film. Because for the audience to follow a character's gaze and see what he or she sees can become an act of identification. If you want it or not, that simple cut to a POV puts you, the audience, in the place of the one who's seeing. You get into his or her mind. You somehow become that character. Anyway, I always put great attention to that combination, the close-up and the corresponding wide shot of the look. It's an essential element of any road movie, because what do you do in a car? You're looking out at something that catches your attention. In Paris, Texas, some of you might have seen the film the other day, I had used that combination, that two-shot combination, so often that eventually I thought I had overdone it. I had overused it. So I started thinking, is there any other way? Can you solve that duality of the eyes and what they see differently? Is there any way to do the trick in one shot? Wouldn't that be good? You see, if you really want to see what your character is really seeing in a road movie, you have to drive a certain stretch of the road twice, so you can turn the camera around to that the second time. And for me, it always matters that you're not cheating the point of view, that your character really sees what's in front of him or her. Theoretically, you could also shoot over someone's shoulder to both see the person and what that person has in front of her or himself. Or you could use the car's many mirrors to both see the one who looks and what he or she sees. However, a film camera, or better, its lens, has a physical limitation. It only has a limited range of focus. Especially when shooting in a car where the inside is darker than the outside, so either the outside is blurred and out of focus or the inside. And you cannot possibly film the person who is looking out of focus. I never do that. I would never do that. And I also hate seeing the landscape out of focus, especially in the American West, where the landscape is so essential. So basically, that unit of two shots that I spoke about, the close-up and the POV, still was the only solution. Not really. Together with Robbie Müller, my DOP, we had once, on another film, used a device that you put in front of your lens called split focus. It's half a lens that you put in front of the real lens, and that enables you to have two different focuses in one picture. The result is mind-blowing, but it's very time-consuming to fiddle around with this gizmo, especially if you use it on a driving car. But Robbie and I decided to use it on Paris, Texas, and to invest an insane amount of time on this effect. See where it took us.
I remember now.
What?
Why about that land?
Oh, why?
Well, Mama once told me that that's where she and Daddy first made love.
Oh, in Paris, Texas?
Yeah,
She told you that?
yeah. So, I figured that that's where I began. I mean, me, Travis Clay Henderson. They named me that. I started out there.
Paris, Texas.
Yeah.
So you think maybe you were conceived there?
Yeah.
Well, you could be right, Travis.
Daddy always had a joke about it.
What was the joke?
He would introduce Mama as the girl he met in Paris. And then he'd wait before he said Texas till everybody thought that he meant. He would wait before he said Texas till everybody thought, after everybody thought he was talking about Paris, France. He always laughed real hard about it. So you live in Los Angeles, huh?
Yeah, well, we live in the suburbs, but I got my business in town.
Yeah, what's your business?
I make billboard signs for advertising.
Oh, yeah? So you're the one who makes those, huh? I love those. Some of them are beautiful.
I'm not the only one in the world that makes them, Trav.
For the translator and the booth up there, I jump back to page 12, the lower third. Sorry. The next excerpt is from the film The American Friend. Did you find it? Yeah. The next excerpt is from the film The American Friend. Its working title was different throughout the shoot. The script was actually called Framed. Quite relevant in our context here. The English word framed doesn't just mean put into a frame, but also betrayed, or to be sunk, or be used as a victim. And Bruno Ganz plays a frame maker in the film, a profession close to my own. And he becomes the victim of Dennis Hopper's character, Tom Ripley. Have a look.
It's December 6th, 1976. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. I know less and less about who I am or who anybody else is.
You've seen in that little clip how much the film elaborated the idea of being in a frame, how much the act of framing by the filmmaker, by me, reverberated also inside my frames, and how much I wanted that act to be transparent. Sorry, but we move on now to the end, to page 15, after my big cut. Sorry. The world of all phenomena and possible images is infinite. It cannot be grasped at all. Each human being alone is an entire universe. Each individual fate is already too much to even outline it vaguely. We are currently seeing new images of the universe thanks to the Hubble telescope and even newer inventions that go beyond all our previous ideas and conceptions, which make our known world appear even smaller. And conversely, in the macro area, even greater insights are opening up into ever smaller units. Storytelling in images is exposed to an ever more overwhelming abundance. How are we supposed to master it and cope with it? Who can possibly take in all the pictures and stories that are produced now, let alone the past, like Ritrovato tries to do it? Every conscious storytelling creates a form through its language, by peeling something out of the infinite abundance which can then stand on its own and thus make sense. Storytelling always wants to create sense, meaning, and context. Word by word, sentence by sentence, it narrows down what its story is, thus excluding everything that could only confuse or destroy it. Storytelling frame by frame can only create a symbolic order when it becomes a language that constantly crystallizes what belongs into the world of its story and at the same time leaves out everything that would only disrupt it. No longer knowing how to create a frame, and with it a framework, opens the flood door to the biggest enemy of storytelling, arbitrariness, in which it matters less and less how something is told, but only what is somehow supposed to be told. Random storytelling, random framing is like garbage collection. It is, in fact, talking garbage. Cinema has always had an important task in times of crisis: to provide orientation and perspective. And God knows, He does. Humanity is facing a gigantic crisis at the moment. In the face of a climate catastrophe of unimagined proportions, the decline of democratic forces, an ongoing loss of the sense for the common good, the rise of nationalist and authoritarian movements, not to mention the widening gap between poverty and insane wealth. Will there be a language to frame all these phenomena? Or will we have to watch a decline of the fantastic wealth of cinema language that we can witness here in Bologna especially? These subjects are certainly far too big for a lecture on framing, but they're unavoidable. We have to face them, and don't worry, not here, not today. Virtual reality and artificial intelligence will throw a whole new light on the act of framing, on guided seeing, and on what it means to have an attitude and to make conscious choices. Anyway, in the course of my own experience with cinema, framing for the moviegoer as well for the craftsmanship of the director has been appreciated less and less. It has even largely disappeared from the director's work, especially with the practice of covering a scene from every possible angle, preconceived on the drawing board, that afterwards it can be edited in any random way. A personal view is therefore needed less and less, or even sadder and worse, no longer in demand. Framing is a personal act. Who does it and what he or she wants to do and express with it will always shine through, though, and the author will become visible behind it. As long as film remains a language and a form of expression, rather than a consumer product conceived by algorithms and artificial intelligence. Maybe you now see a little better the symbolical and universal importance of the act of framing. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.